CIC Vancouver and Victoria. But Winnipeg stepped up to the breach on the set of issues related to security, and so they've done a fantastic job. Hats off to Brad Kerbison, who's been the lead organizer, and then Dennis Kovtun, who's managing the details of today's event and has been working really hard. Really proud of our colleagues in Winnipeg. I'm thrilled to be moderating a discussion with Chris Alexander as the keynote for this event. For a few reasons. Chris and I did have the honor of working together in the Foreign Service on very similar issues and on security. I mean, we did work side by side in Kabul when I was Deputy Head of Mission and he was on leave working as the Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General. But I think actually for today's event, the more relevant connection in the careers of Chris and I was 2003, when as still relatively junior diplomats, me more junior than him in this case, but he was assigned as Canada's first resident ambassador in Afghanistan, and I was sent as Canada's sole diplomat to Baghdad. So these two conflicts that really defined a whole decade, not only of international security and of Canadian foreign policy, the conflict in Iraq that Canada did not participate in, that we parted company with the United States and the United Kingdom, and therefore only had one junior diplomat to send to Baghdad. And conversely, this other major conflict in Afghanistan, in which Canada got in a big way, launching a really large diplomatic presence, eventually taking responsibility for an entire province, and the province that was the home base of the Taliban, getting engaged in the first major combat operation in 60 years for our country. Something that's really shaped the future of shaped where Canadian foreign policy is right now. Those two different paths that we took in 2008 were the result of decisions made by the government of the day in the way that it conceptualized international security, what constituted a real threat to Canada, what are the kinds of responses that are legitimate for Canada to take, with diametrically different answers for those two conflicts. Those questions, we can get into those particular countries because unfortunately both of them are still very much at war, in spite of our best efforts in Afghanistan and in spite of, or perhaps because of what the United States did in Iraq. We'll leave that to the discussion period afterwards. But the question set remains very much with the current government and any government that will take over in Ottawa. What are the principal threats to Canada in the world? What are the appropriate responses? What are the kinds of things that Canada could do? Who should we be working with on them, and how should we prioritize our action in a world that seems to be getting ever more dangerous? Chris will be talking to us about the rise of authoritarianism as one particular challenge, and I'm looking forward to his contributions. I will ask the first few questions, and then I will open it up to the audience. So just a sort of technical note for those of you that are watching, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I will be looking to the questions that are written in that Q&A box to field them to Chris. And so if you do have any questions along the way, please write them in there. With no further ado, Chris, you've already been introduced by my colleague, Robert, and we'll look forward to hearing your remarks.
Thank you so much, Ben. And thanks, Robert, for organizing this, to all of your team. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you and with Winnipeg and your very strong branch at the center of Canada, at the center of the continent in many ways, and historically at the center of a lot of the best thinking that's happened in Canada over the years, over the decades, to set our foreign policy on the right paths, to keep it on the right paths. And I'm a huge fan of human security in its substantive version as an overarching objective for Canada. Very proud to be part of this exercise that you've launched under that banner. And also to be taking part in something innovative, a deliberative approach to developing foreign policy. And in that spirit, I've tried to lay out in this talk a bigger picture from my perspective on where Canada has gone over the past century in our foreign policy, and what the challenges are for us today, 1/5 of the way into the 21st century. So I'll get right to it. Our first century in foreign policy, a quick appraisal, and the way ahead. I think there's an argument for saying that our greatest moment on the international stage so far may still have been our debut. Canada had loomed large at points in British and French history, imperial history, as well as during the American Revolution. Our trade, Pacific, Arctic, and Atlantic, had always been significant, but it was the Canadian Corps at the Somme and Vimy, then as the Allied spearhead to victory during the 100 Days, that first etched our mark on history, the history of foreign policy and international relations in indelible ink. How did a well-armed, well-led group of 4 heavy infantry divisions impact foreign policy, you may ask? Well, without our outsized role on the crater-filled battlefields of Flanders, Sir Robert Borden wouldn't have signed the Treaty of Versailles. He wouldn't have been allowed. Mackenzie King wouldn't have been able to take the positions he took at imperial conferences in 1921 and 1926, nor would R.B. Bennett have negotiated the Treaty of Westminster in 1931. The 1926 Imperial Conference produced the Balfour Declaration, as many of you know, which confirmed the Dominions were equal in status. The Treaty of Westminster made us formally independent. In between those conferences, the Canadian International Council, its predecessor version, was launched in 1928 at Borden's home in Ottawa. The impressive bipartisan cast included Sir Arthur Currie, who gave Canada its First World War reputation for strong leadership, as well as distinguished Manitobans like J.W. Defoe and John Alexander Mackay, the president of Manitoba College from 1920 for most of 2 decades. But why were they meeting? Borden was concerned that Canada was neglecting its international vocation, that apathy had the upper hand. Does this sound familiar to us today? Unfortunately, yes. And it would have been hard to disagree that the international scene in 1926, 27, almost 100 years ago, was quite bleak. Germany had entered the League as a permanent member of its council on the basis of the Locarno treaties in 26, by which Berlin finally recognized its reduced Rhineland borders. Later in 1928, the year of Borden's meeting, the Kellogg-Briand Pact sought to, quote, condemn recourse to war for the solution of international controversies and renounce it as an instrument of national policy. It was an attempt pushed by the Americans to outlaw war. But in 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, and there was an almost unbroken series of wars of aggression by fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, and Soviet Russia in the lead up to the Second World War. So what was a middle power like Canada with little heft and a vanishingly small military in those years after the end of the First World War, to do? Back in the 1920s, we had, of course, yet to choose a course in foreign policy. Mackenzie King was an instinctive continentalist with an unhealthy dollop of fascination for dictators like Mussolini and Stalin. He certainly wasn't alone in that. Borden and many Tories were mainly unabashed British imperialists, determined to make Canada's voice heard in those councils. Raoul d'Endurant, Henri Bourassa, and others were de facto isolationists, happy to be, quote, far from inflammable materials, in d'Endurant's famous phrase. Their view was, on the whole, the view of most Canadians, weary and wary of the Great War's massive toll. So how have we done, in all honesty, over this century? Our diplomacy for a few decades, particularly in the 40s and 50s, was second to none. Our military contributions were vital, exceptional even, in both world wars. In the second, especially on sea, in the air, and on land, in Italy and in Northern Europe after D-Day. In peacetime, both in the 1920s and 30s and after 1960, our military commitment fell off rather sharply. But we were pioneers in development assistance with the Colombo Plan and Pearson's commitment to 0.7%, one that we've chronically failed to meet since the 1970s under governments of all complexions. So have we shown leadership? Yes, occasionally on disarmament, with the Ottawa Convention on Landmines, on trade, on ending apartheid, on reuniting Europe, on support for democracy and Ukraine, on the institutionalization of peacekeeping. But there is not one conflict since 1945, if my take on history is right, that Canada can claim to have shown leadership in permanently resolving. In fact, there's not one we can claim to have given our full attention to seeking to resolve, except perhaps Cyprus, where failure was almost foreordained, and we aren't the only ones who failed. The one international issue where we've been consistently in the front rank of nations is immigration and refugee policy, but this is not foreign policy. So the grounds for apathy remain. What has eluded Canada? What has gone wrong? Obviously, we failed in most instances to mobilize public opinion to any great international purpose. We've mostly neglected our institutional foundations for international action. Despite a well-educated public and civil society institutions like the CIC that are arguably second to none, our fellow citizens have tended to want to stay focused on their knitting, running their businesses, building careers, sustaining communities, staying close to home. Why? Well, my view is that the answer to this question doesn't lie in Canada, but rather abroad. Canadians could see in the 20s and 30s that the Treaty of Versailles had left Europe's fundamental schisms unresolved. They knew that Soviet, Japanese, Italian fascist, and Nazi militarism, already running amok in many places, were on paths to wider rebirth with dire consequences. But they didn't see any way to stop this madness. In the post-war era, we did more. Canadians embraced the fight to free Korea from communism. We rightly recoiled from the war in Vietnam, as we did from the war in Iraq, that left no enduring legacy and in fact were huge disasters. But Canadians stood together with fellow democracies in the Commonwealth, Europe, Korea, Japan, and elsewhere when it counted. We rejoiced when the Soviet Union imploded. We acted to stabilize the former Yugoslavia. We responded when terrorism threatened from Afghanistan. We were eager to see new democratic movements empowered in Iran, Egypt, Libya, and Syria, only to see them disabled and crushed. We were champions of the WTO, of free trade with the United States and later Mexico, of the Pacific Alliance, of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the Canada-EU Partnership Agreement. We advocated cooperation agreement, I should say. We advocated financial stability and fiscal consolidation after a devastating financial crisis before the world became entranced again by protectionism and deficit spending. In other words, Canadians have been keen to make the effort necessary to ensure others enjoy what we take for granted, but it's been difficult to find the opportunity to make secure borders, freedom and deep diversity, the rule of law, growing prosperity, an enduring reality for other countries. So why have these efforts failed? Well, there are three main reasons in my assessment. First, a whole raft of countries, several of them very large, do not believe in the rule-governed nation state, but rather in some form of neo-imperialism or neo-colonialism. They suborn their neighbors, fuel corruption, engage in economic coercion, and prosecute proxy wars. In doing so, they wreck stability and turn investments in reliable institutions to dust. Second, the policy of our allies at the moment is a wreck. Beyond enlargement, Europe, despite the outsized power of its example, doesn't know what to do with itself. The US has lurched from 9/11 to the subprime crisis to Iraq to Trump, increasing its defense budget at every turn while becoming progressively less coherent in policy terms. The UK is arguably even worse. Australia, Israel, Denmark, Norway, and a few other democracies punch above their weights, but none as a leader. Canada uses foreign policy reviews as a substitute for actually doing anything in the world. And I'm not talking about the CIC review, I mean government reviews here. Third, the international institutions on which we multilateralists depend are playing catch up almost everywhere. Politics lags economic and strategic reality. As a result, we're missing the opportunity to bring stability, better governance, prosperity, and respect for human rights to scores of countries the world over. Now, these are not new issues. They're at least as old as the League of Nations, founded in 1920. The waters of multilateral action have been muddied anew, at least since Vietnam. Current battles over economic paradigms, the changing reputations of major states, and the fight for democracy, the rule of law, and financial accountability, these are all new versions of the same old disputes. But there's a difference. The League of Nations began in 1920 with 42 members. In late 1934 and early 1935, it hit 58 members, a record. but only 24 remain members from start to finish. In other words, the League of Nations fell apart as successive members rejected its authority and its rules. In fact, with the US remaining aloof thanks to an isolationist Congress, it never got properly started. The UN began in 1945 with 50 countries. Today it has 193. None has withdrawn, although in 1971, the Republic of Korea, Taiwan, was replaced by the People's Republic of China, as you all know. In other words, the world still accepts the principles of the UN Charter. Upholding them should, in my view, remain the theme of Canada's foreign policy, as it has been for every major foreign policy review since 1970. The rules-based international system is certainly weakened. In some areas, it is fraying badly at the edges. But as you, Ben, our CIC president, wrote back in July, quote, "We don't have the luxury of withdrawing from a world in disorder." I see three areas where Canada could make a critical difference. First, to counter the new authoritarians and their proxy wars, we need to ensure the costs of irregular and hybrid warfare remain unacceptably high. We achieved this to some degree after Putin's Russia invaded Ukraine. We have not done so for Pakistan and Iran, both now waging large-scale proxy wars in neighboring states, or for China, where levels of domestic repression constitute genocide and coercive external policies are now both commonplace and warlike. Allies need to call out police, holding them to account with political and economic sanctions. Second, we need to challenge economic models that undermine our own institutions. In 1971, the United States, Canada, and other advanced economies began building a new relationship with the PRC. In 1989, we decided that economic cooperation would take precedence over democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. In 2001, China became a WTO member despite opaque markets and an authoritarian regime. Today, it's the world's second largest economy and top exporter of goods with the world's largest trade surplus. At the same time, it is the world's most coercive state, bankrolling corruption and digital surveillance on a scale that would have been unimaginable to George Orwell. To safeguard our prosperity and freedom while avoiding perverse forms of economic dependency, Canada and other market-based democracies should combine existing free trade, common market, and economic cooperation initiatives into a global alliance committed to basic freedoms, democratic institutions, and market principles. This would include Canada, the United States, the European Union, Japan, Mexico, the Pacific Alliance, South Korea, India, Australia, and the United Kingdom, New Zealand, and other countries in Asia, Europe, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. The goal would be to build a new prosperity that does not usher in authoritarian influence, corrupt practices, or state surveillance by the back door. In many respects, the greatest challenge of the 20th century so far, and this is the third point, has been the near disappearance of the human rights and humanitarian agenda, as well as the new challenge of disinformation and propaganda. These two problems are, of course, related. It's more or less impossible to defend human rights activists in Egypt or Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh if public debate is buried under layers of defamatory, conspiracy-laden populist sludge, and when well-sourced, carefully edited factual reporting has been decimated by social media platforms addicted to ignorance and polarization. To respond, we need new defenses against information warfare. The CBC should be expanded with stronger international, indigenous, and environmental mandates. Social media giants should be regulated. Hate speech and state-backed disinformation shut down. Canada's global network of embassies, high commissions, and consulates should be much larger, more innovative, and more directly engaged in issues of asylum and refugees while promoting democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. The key conclusion we need to draw from our first century as an independent foreign policy player is that our security is anchored in our democracy and in alliances among democracies. As the country with 28% of the world's boreal zone, the world's third largest forests overall, and the longest coastlines, Canada has a profound stake in protecting wildlife and wilderness, ecosystems and habitat, rivers, lakes, and oceans, as well as in averting catastrophic disasters. We should be models of exemplary sustainable practices in each of these environments, but ultimately, our safety and success are rooted in education, innovation, and keeping our word. The international treaties that define Canada, as well as the ones we've been signing independently since 1919, link up with the Crown's treaties with all Indigenous peoples right back to Niagara in 1764, the French and British treaties of the 18th century in the Maritimes, the Great Peace of Montreal in 1701, and the Confederacy of the Three Fires, the Covenant Change, and other covenant chain and other treaty arrangements that preceded European settlement. In the end, the principal theme of Canadian foreign policy has been relatively consistent. We've championed the rights of peoples and countries to live, work, and trade freely, to have secure borders, to have equal opportunities without interference or coercion. We still believe people everywhere seek to enjoy these basic conditions for peace, development, and prosperity, and that every country should aspire and strive to achieve them. For Canadians, there's never been a contradiction between domestic and foreign policy. We know our destinies are intertwined. As John Watson, the professor of moral philosophy at Queen's University for decades, wrote in 1919, the year of Versailles, the union of love of country with devotion to the cause of humanity is the true ideal, and neither a selfish patriotism nor a vague humanitarianism that leads to nothing but neglect of the duty that lies nearest. In my strong view, the rules-based international order, while bruised and even slightly battered, is far from finished. On the contrary, its best days almost certainly lie ahead, but it needs protection now more than ever to ensure the basic principles of the UN Charter are no longer flouted. To get there, we need a Canada that's prepared to show leadership when others will not, a country that stands up for the principles that have underpinned our success and reinforces its profile and action with allies around the world. Thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Chris, and particularly for that historical sweep to go back to the onset of Canada's international role in the First World War. Thank you for the tip of the hat to our organization, which was then called the Canadian Institute for International Affairs, and formed very much for that reason, and for the reason that brings us together today, which is to bring Canadian citizens into a discussion that is too often seen as reserved for people like we used to be, government officials, either at the political or civil society level. This is a matter for all Canadians to care about, something that was eminently obvious to everyone in the First World War, when every family had someone fighting in the trenches, and has been the case in other conflicts, but I think escapes that reality of the dangerous nature of the world and the impact it might have on Canadians, perhaps a little bit more distant. I'm going to ask a first question, which is sort of looking back, and then a second question will be looking forward. And the looking back, I was struck by a unifying theme that you suggested to many of the challenges that we're seeing in the international realm and international security, which is the tendencies of certain major authoritarian powers that don't buy into the set of international norms captured in the UN Charter and generally associated with the rule of law, democracy, human rights, etc. I think that will strike some Canadians as counterintuitive. If I might express what I would think might be the sort of majority framing that many Canadians bring, which is that there is a body of international norms that has been advanced by Canada over many years, but as that's fraying, it might just be that it's giving way to sort of a greater diversity, and maybe diversity is not such a bad thing after all. Who are we to tell other countries what to do, et cetera, et cetera. So that normative consensus that seems so strong, say in the 1990s and 2000s, doesn't strike some Canadians, I think, as a problem in and of itself, and that perhaps there are some other good ideas that other countries have.
Yeah.
But I may be oversimplifying that, but I find your argument an interesting counterpoint to that there certainly is another set of ideas out there. There's probably millions of ideas, but there's a consistent set of ideas among certain powerful countries that are actually deeply in conflict with human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. And those should be seen perhaps not just as a failure, we weren't able to convince China to buy onto the international norms, but actually an agenda in and of itself, and perhaps an agenda that's shared between these different groups. I guess the question I'd like to ask is there sort of a consistent set of authoritarian norms that is on the rise, and have we underestimated that up until now?
Great question. I think the answer is yes, but one has to move on quickly to say that, as you were suggesting earlier, that the problem's always been there. My observation is simply that it's worse now in the last 10 or 20 years for a number of reasons. And I don't think most people are aware. You and I worked on a piece on this for the CIC, of how successful the international community was through the UN, through all the regional security arrangements there are, at preventing what had happened in the 20s and 30s from happening again. In other words, preventing borders from being changed by force in wars of aggression, where an army crossed the border, seized territory, or something like the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact happened and a big chunk of Europe was divided between Hitler and Stalin. That didn't happen after 1945, in spite of all the wars that were there, because of the principles of the Charter and because they were enforced. I think many Canadians are aware that Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine was unprecedented in those respects. I mean, people in Winnipeg certainly are aware, members of the CIC are certainly aware that this was something new. It was denied, of course, at first, but it happened. And I think that year, 2014, has to be seen as a watershed. Now, there were some irredentist moves by Yeltsin and Putin that preceded 2014. And since then, there have been moves by other countries. I mentioned Iran and Pakistan. Now I think we'd have to add Turkey to the list that would constitute irredentism. And China has border disputes where it's actively using military force and shifting things with India and other countries. So this is an issue that is with us, that is of growing concern, certainly to experts. I think members of CIC know quite a lot about these issues. Canadians as a whole don't. And why is that? Well, partly because these wars are not the old style state-to-state wars. They are covert. They are being done in deniable ways. No one who's been reading any newspaper really now thinks that Putin isn't behind the illegal occupation of Crimea and Donbass. But the story of Pakistan and Afghanistan is far from totally told. Iran's involvement in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon is not well known outside of the region. You know cases of proxy wars from Latin America. There are a number in Africa. So these wars don't have the profile, the unambiguous profile of the wars of old with armies in uniform crossing borders. And why is that? Well, if you write about these things in these countries as a journalist, you will be considered one of the enemy and probably will have a tough time reporting it or a tough time surviving. And then there's the disinformation that goes along with it. Foreign reporting by quality media outlets has declined. The amount of rumor, conspiracy theory, and propaganda that people get on all kinds of foreign subjects has grown. All of that makes it harder to bring these issues into focus, but they are really there. And I think governments and strong organizations like yours have a responsibility to bring them into focus and shine light on them. And I do see some progress being made. In Europe, there's more awareness of these issues. In the Biden platform, there's more talk of these issues than one had seen previously. What we do about them is still a question for debate, but we're putting ideas forward today, which is a good thing.
Great. So my forward-looking question then, frankly, is about President-elect Biden. The solution that you identified to Canada addressing these threats to national security and the advance of authoritarianism, if I quote you correctly here, Canada's security is anchored in other democracies and should be anchored in some kind of grouping of democracies, perhaps even an alliance. So what we know from what Secretary Biden has written on foreign policy, most recently a foreign affairs article in the spring of 2020, is one of his first acts as president will be to convene a summit of democracies. And the countries have mentioned, very similar to the list that you've mentioned, those that have basic freedoms and market principles at their core. And so our government is going to be getting an invitation shortly to show up at a summit, presumably sometime in 2021. If the Canadian government were to fully seize this opportunity, what agenda should Canada be bringing to the table? What would success look like according to Chris Alexander, as an outcome statement of Biden's security summit, or is there another venue where we should be bringing that agenda?
Well, I think the greatest achievement will be to have the meeting, because there has been such a retreat from alliances by the outgoing administration in Washington that the repair job is going to take a while. But what should be on the agenda? I think the strongest message we can send to all of those who would undermine the rules, subvert the international system, coerce their neighbors, is that if you are a democracy and if you are in an alliance or a strong partnership with other democracies, there will be economic benefits from this. We need to bring our economies even closer on a well-negotiated, balanced basis with, full attention to labor market issues and environmental issues. But we need to take the more unified markets that we now have in the world that have grown up over the last 3 decades since 1989, NAFTA, the EU, and the various Asian groupings of democratic economies, and bring them closer together so that there is a trans-Pacific connection among democracies that is stronger and a transatlantic connection that is stronger. And it's the US that has walked away from those transoceanic commitments in recent years. So the biggest signal and the best we can do is to try and get the US to walk back into the door while ensuring that Canada has a leadership role and plays an example, because we have more strong partnership and free trade agreements with these countries, arguably, than anyone else. So I think that's number one. And then the other issue is safeguarding democracy and standing up to the threats that these countries represent by use of armed force through proxies. I really think proxy wars are a bigger threat than state-to-state wars or terrorism, as we used to refer to it, and we should sort of develop a vocabulary and a tradition of talking about these wars, making explicit what is going on in a much fuller way, and this group of democracies will be well positioned to do that. I mean, what are we saying about the importance of democracy? Well, basically, democracies don't fight one another. They make each other more prosperous through trade. NATO, the biggest club of democracies that represents an alliance, has created an unprecedented space for security in Europe and the North Atlantic. Other democracies are envious of that, and NATO now has partnerships with other countries. The US and Canada have partnerships with lots of other democracies. We should try and lock that in and institutionalize it, because we know that democracy is under threat, and some countries that were heading in a democratic direction have now gone in the opposite direction. We need to make sure that we draw a line under those setbacks and then start to set conditions for democracy to resume its progress in the world, as I'm sure it will eventually.
Great. I'm going to ask one final question, and then I'll be turning to the audience. I see that we already have 6 questions or so. Please continue to type your answers in Q&A, and then we'll ask them in bunches. We have until 2, so we should have plenty of time to get to all the questions that were there so far. The third question I guess I would have is, as we're contemplating these deeper relations with fellow democracies that you're calling for, traditionally there is a quite rigid division between foreign policy and domestic political matters. So even in a classic alliance of liberal democracies such as NATO, from the 1940s onward, NATO was always about coordinating our mostly military matters, but there was some political coordination, but on international political issues. You would never have, Belgium as one NATO country commenting on, say, the domestic politics of Canada, for example. Those were considered not appropriate for that kind of forum. And yet, those consolidated, the strength of democracy in those NATO countries have not really been questioned much until recently. What we've been seeing in several liberal democracies, particularly in many of them in Europe, Turkey, obviously a major part of NATO that is seems to be anything but democratic at this stage, and even the United States, the oldest functioning democracy in the world, just this month taking some extremely alarming steps towards imagining a future in which the Constitution might not be respected and there might not be a transfer. It looks, as of yesterday, with the General Services Administration initiating the transition process, that the United States will remain a democracy. But the fact that we're even having this debate about how
unbelievable
is and something we probably should be taking more seriously. I'm sure lots and lots of Canadians are thinking, well, once Trump is gone, that'll deal with that problem. We'll get back to the good old days. But what if there is serious weakening of democratic systems within these allies that we built? Is there some responsibility that liberal democracies have to one another to help shore up the strength of democracy in their countries? And is that something that would be a legitimate area for cooperation in a new kind of alliance that you're calling for?
Yes, absolutely. And you put the challenge very well. I mean, look at the United States over these past 4 years. Who would have imagined? I mean, I was reading novels in the 1990s about the Kremlin having a candidate they had groomed over, Manchurian type candidate in the White House. And this was, sensational fiction. It didn't even sell very well at the time. It seemed so far-fetched. And yet for 4 years, I, as someone who spent more of my career in and on Russia than anywhere else, had to face the fact that the president of the United States was probably being influenced more by Vladimir Putin than he was by any other world leader. And that there was a very sophisticated Russian influence operation to get him into place, and that it was one of the factors that brought him into office. And there are other cases, Russian involvement in Brexit, other countries trying to emulate what Russia's doing, China with its more subtle, but in many ways more pervasive influence operations. We need to understand these things, and we need to share insights, not allow ourselves to be divided and conquered by adversaries that want to literally mess with democracy. So there's a long way to go there before we get to where we need to be. I think we can do it, though. At the same time, we need to be careful that peer review of fellow democracies doesn't descend into just engaging in a partisan way in everyone's election because we have our preferences. We have to give space for democracies to be democratic, and then speak up when there are threats to the system, as there has been in the US, as there is now in Poland and Hungary, to the rule of law and free media and so forth. That's mostly a challenge for the EU, but it's a challenge for all of us. These are our allies. And we have to make sure that there are clear limits. And peer review is a good thing. I mean, I can't remember whether it's The Economist or another organization that ranks democracies, but I was stunned, as I think Ben, to read that the list of full democracies in the world today is something like, not far above 20, and that the US is no longer considered by this ranking a full democracy. That should ring alarm bells, and it should also inspire us to strive to be better at democracy, to have more public engagement, more citizen-driven exercises like this one, more reviews of the rule of law, of institutions, sector by sector. That's what's going to keep our complex societies healthy. And I think it really, when you drill down to what does it mean for you? Well, it means, are your municipal councillors corrupt? Are your judges chosen on the basis of merit or some political factor? That does matter to people when you bring it down to the ground level. And I think that kind of peer review among democracies at all levels is a good thing, but it needs to be done carefully so that we don't interfere with the autonomous life of democracies at all levels as well. We need to watch and intervene when there's a problem, but otherwise give people space to participate and live the lives and deepen the democratic realities of their communities, as we know they mostly will.
That's great. Thank you very much. Let's turn now to the questions of some of our audience members. I might group some of them together when they're on similar themes, and in the interest of time. So we've got two that are about the impact that this new grouping of democracies might create in the world, and it might create a bit of a schism between two sets of countries in the world. So the first comes from Stephen Lunn, a longtime member of the CIC Winnipeg. He asks, should we anticipate a geographical fragmentation of international law where different regions recognize a different set of norms and rules differently from another region? Cyberspace and the use of information communications technologies seem to be an important example where this is happening. What role could Canada play in a world where the application of international law is up for debate? And I hope I'm doing some justice to these questions by grouping them together. Second one from Wesley Warwick, an expert in national security and intelligence from the University of Ottawa. How would a division of the global economy into two blocks impact on efforts to deal with existential problems? And I think I can read into this other major security threats. One of them that he mentions, of course, is climate change.
Right. Fantastic. Well, first on the rule of law, I mean, clearly there's scope always in the rule of law for bottom down, top down, and bottom up. There is statutory law, there is international law that is driven by conventions and treaties, but there is also, certainly in our country, but in many parts of the world, customary law, common law, and law that is very specific to niche sectors of business or very local problems. And we need all of that to have the rule of law. I think the key is to ensure that certain principles are observed, whatever country you're in, whatever system you're in. The best expression of those principles that I've seen is from the Bingham Center in London, and I can't remember whether it's 9 or 12 principles, but it's issues, it's imperatives like the independence of the judiciary and of prosecutors, the right to a defense, the fact that laws need to be published and legal review needs to take place. Principles like that can be applied to almost any legal system, whether it's statutory, Code Civil au Québec, or common law, or local, and whatever continent you're on. I think we need to do more to understand what are the principles that constitute the rule of law in all of its diversity around the world. Secondly, on dividing the world, I think we're a long way from facing that issue. I don't think anyone is calling for, Biden, Trump, Europeans, any serious political voice is calling for expulsion of China from the WTO or similar messages with regard to Russia or other countries, despite the concerns that we have. All we're saying, those of us I think who champion this deeper cooperation among democracies, is that there should be economic benefits. And there's an economic logic to bringing democracies together, because free markets depend very much on free institutions, democratic practices, free speech. I mean, the scrutiny that markets need to be at their best that's hence the concern over Hong Kong. What will Hong Kong as a place to do business look like with the backsliding and reverses that democracy has sustained there? So no one's going to stop trading with China overnight. I think everyone wants to see more balanced trade relationship. No one wants to see coercion when China doesn't get what it wants. We were all up in arms about the Patriot Act in the United States only a few years ago, which went too far, by almost everyone's account and had to be rolled back in the Obama era. Well, the digital surveillance that China is conducting against its own citizens and everyone around the world goes much further. And we haven't even started to talk about these things. So, it's hard to get public support for a lot of these initiatives because they haven't been brought to public light on the scale that they should. I think one of the problems there was that everyone has, for 4 years or more, turned very much inward and focused on Trump, focused on Brexit, focused on a few crises in a few countries. These are international issues, and we need to turn our gaze outward again and start looking at what has been happening on the international stage in the meantime. And with a new administration in Washington, we'll be in a much better position to start doing that. But Canada should be doing its part. And great experts like Wesley and others, Ron Diebert, who made his Massey lecture recently, are striking great blows for understanding of these issues, but we need much more.
Great. I'm going to ask two other questions in a group, and these are both about how Canada practices diplomacy and how we engage in the world and some of the obstacles to that. First of all, I stand corrected by our CIC Winnipeg host that we're getting up to 3 o'clock, not 2 o'clock. Chris and I are actually based in the Greater Toronto area, but of course this event is hosted in Winnipeg. So yes, we're in Central Time right now. First question from a fellow Torontonian here, Monty McMurchie, who asks, the issue is salient, is transactional leadership by liberals and conservatives in matters foreign, such as defense procurement, along with foreign policy intervention, is calibrated explicit in re-election. I might have to restate that just to make sure that I understand it correctly. And Monty, I certainly invite you to correct me if I'm.
Yeah, no, I think I got it, Ben. I know Monty.
Sexual nature, okay. A second related question here is, how can Canada promote human security on the world stage when we're perceived by some Canadians to fall short of our exhortations at home, the credibility question? More importantly, how do we convince Canadians that spending money around the world when we face such significant challenges here at home?
Yeah, both excellent questions. I mean, yes, I think both parties that have held office in foreign governments in Ottawa have been guilty of making our foreign policy, our international policy, far too transactional, far too short term, and that does happen to some extent in every democracy. But I think the countries with a deeper history of international relations tend to take more serious approaches to these issues in elections, and we just need to take the next step forward. There are certain issues that should be nonpartisan, in my view. We should always debate things, and governments will always give different emphases, but there are certain commitments Canada has made in the fields of security, I would argue in immigration and refugee policy, where it should be most of the time beyond partisan politics. And we should be having discussions like this, non-partisan discussions about what Canada does next, whatever government is in office. But to do that, we need people who are members of the CIC, are interested in these issues, to take interest in elections, to put their names on ballots. We need people who, with experience in these issues, from business, from government, from civil society, to go to Ottawa and be part of governments or join governments as advisors and as staffers. On the question of what was the other question?
It was about our credibility in.
Oh yeah, our credibility. Of course, we cannot expect anything but grief abroad, so long as we still have boil water orders at dozens for dozens of First Nations on dozens of reserves across this country, and as so long as the inequalities in opportunities and outcomes in terms of education, work, mental health, suicide, and so forth for Indigenous Canadians are what they are, so far behind people who live not far away from them. And so we have to keep working on that. At the same time, we can't lose our perspective. Canada is the leading country in the world for immigration because people see life here as being much better than where they're coming from. And a lot of those people have come in recent years from the United States and France, which were facing huge challenges for different reasons. So the two go together. We must never lose sight of the fact that we have an urgent agenda at home that reflects centuries of mistreatment, racism, and systemic failure. At the same time, we can't lose sight of the fact that our prosperity, our success, to the extent we've been successful in Canada, depends on being an outward-looking country connected to other markets by immigration, trade, and 1,000 different umbilical cords. And those two things go together. And isolationist Canada will not do better on its domestic imperatives. I think we've seen that in all kinds of other contexts in other countries, including in our own history. Similarly, a Canada that goes abroad, as that quote from John Watson says, to do good in the world, but neglects the people next door, will also fail. We need to strike a balance between being active citizens in the world and being good neighbors and good keepers and friends of those who live right beside us. There is no contradiction between those two principles.
Okay, got a final two questions about other countries in the mix. And as it turns out with these two questions, countries on either side of this emerging divide between democracies and autocracies. So the first comes from Alex King, who agrees that a more cooperative group with global democracies is in the interests of Canada. Specifically, he would like to see us engage non-core allies in playing a larger role promoting democracy and collective security. Groups like the OAS and to a lesser extent the African Union have shown that they can play important roles in defending democracy regionally. How can we integrate and expand the camp of countries who stand with us to strengthen global democracies? So that's on the one side. On the other side, Brad Curbison, the past president of CIC Winnipeg, asks how you would recommend that Canada approach its relationship with China. Do we have any leverage, for example, to push for the release of Michael Kovrig, our former colleague, and Michael Sabo?
Oh, fantastic questions. First on democracy, I couldn't agree more that the OAS should be a privileged partner, because we have seen steps backward. You know, Ben, you know Venezuela better than any of us, as well as many of the other countries in South America that were, and the Caribbean, in fact, that were, and Central America, that were further down the path towards what we thought would be enduring democratic institutions and balanced 2- or 3-party systems that are no longer, that can no longer be described in those terms. My own view is that if we're going to work with the OAS or others, you know, just empowering our missions and doing things locally is always the right thing. But if we want to have a real impact, we need to understand clearly what has gone wrong and try and fix some big things with some big partners. I mean, one of the issues in the latest US election that I know affects democratic politics across Latin America has been the rise of populism and the news sources that go with it, that fuel it, conspiracy theories, disinformation. I happen to know that Russia, instead of investing in new platforms for disinformation in the United States itself, in the last couple of years did quite a lot to invest in Spanish and Portuguese speaking platforms. And that had some impact on voters in South Florida, I would argue, perhaps in some parts of Texas. But it's also wreaked havoc with democracy in Mexico and other parts of Latin America. How do we handle this information challenge around the world? How do we strengthen legitimate, factual news sources around the world? I think that's a big question for democracy everywhere, including in Latin America. And then the other issue on China. We need to do two things. First, we need to join our allies that are doing much more than we are. China, even Australia, even New Zealand, certainly the United States, even Europe are revisiting their relationship with China in a much deeper way than Canada has so far done. So we need to play catch up. Secondly, we can't underrate the leverage that we have. China has a huge trade surplus with Canada. They export far more to us than we to them. And there are all kinds of ways that we could use the leverage that that represents to have more political influence in Beijing. We also have the power of our example. What Canada does is at least studied and followed by other democracies and often emulated, as Ben and I both know from our respective experiences. If we were to be more principled in our relationship with China, we would take ourselves a long distance towards being in a stronger position. When an ambassador to China, for example, says the kinds of things they've been saying in Ottawa, not just the current one, but the previous one or two, that needs a response. Those statements are unprecedented. And for Chinese ambassadors to be saying those things without a strong reply from an elected Canadian official is a sign of weakness so far. I'm sure we will get to the point where we turn a corner on this, but right now we've looked pretty spineless, and it's time to change course, catch up with our allies, and show some principle.
Well, thank you so much. We have come up to 3 o'clock Central Time, and so I'll stop there. Robert, should I do the thanking of Chris, or would you like to do that?
I'll take it, I guess.
All right. Over to you, Robert.
All right. Well, thank you, Chris and Ben, for a fascinating hour-long discussion. We were honored to have Chris with us today. He brought his wealth of experience and background to the discussion. His history lesson was fascinating for many of us, I think, and the discussion and the good ideas that flowed from the Q&A session, I think, are worthy of further consideration in how we move forward with Canadian foreign policy. It's a big challenge to identify the right issues to prioritize. It's a big challenge to convince Canadians that they need to be prioritized, as those of us who are interested in the foreign policy environment believe they should be prioritized. And so for that reason, Chris, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us today, and welcome you to join us for the wrap-up sessions. There will be 2 of them, one today at 1:30 and another one tomorrow at 1:30, where we will discuss sort of the broad themes that came out of the discussions of the panels. So we'd be happy for you to come back and join us in half an hour or so to for that discussion. And Ben's supposed to be leading it. So, and I think Ben has disappeared from us, but I will thank him anyway for being here today and helping us present this what we think is an important event, which is foreign policy by Canadians. Our goal is to engage Canadians, to solicit their ideas, give them a platform for sharing their thoughts and ideas, in the hope that we can feed some of those ideas into the deliberative democracy event that'll happen at the end of February. So with that, thank you, Chris. Just for the attendees who haven't all bailed out on us yet, we will be back. You're more than welcome to join us at 1:30 for the wrap-up session if you have the time. And our next formal event for the conference will be tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock Winnipeg time. I have to talk to Ben a little bit about time zones. He seems to be confused, but that's okay. Having lived overseas a great deal of my military career, it's not hard to screw up the time zones when you're not paying close attention. So, and so we will see you, Chris, later. Thank you. And we will see the folks in the attendees later, we hope. We've got 2 more panels tomorrow, 3 speakers each. Another keynote presentation with Alan Rock, former Liberal Party MP and cabinet minister. And I think it's going to be just as interesting tomorrow as it was today. Thank you.